Okay, if you could have your textbook in front of you, I'm going to talk us through the chapter on determinism and free will, seeing as I wrote it, and hopefully on page 206 you'll have some of your memories refreshed, or this might be coming to you for the first time. So we're going to begin with this amazing story of one of the most famous cases in US legal history in 1924. The very famous lawyer Clarence Darrow took this case, and two very wealthy boys who were sons of prosperous Chicago families had been reading detective novels, and they got it in their heads to plan the perfect murder, and they took a cousin of theirs and they killed him in the back of a car and poured acid over his body to make identification difficult. They'd hired a car and they drew him into the car to discuss the tennis racket. So a heinous crime. It was the trial of the century. And Clarence Darrow managed to get them life imprisonment as opposed to execution. And he did this by getting them to plead guilty, and he got the trial heard by a judge instead of a jury. And to that judge, he made this extraordinary appeal here. So he's saying that the boys are not responsible because, as it says here, they didn't choose their background. So he's saying, nature is strong as she is pitiless. She works in her mysterious ways, and we are her victims. We have not so much to do with it ourselves. Nature takes this job in hand. What had this boy to do with it? He was not his own father. He was not his own mother. All of this was handed to him. He did not surround himself with governesses and wealth. He did not make himself, and yet he's compelled to pay. Now, that's extraordinary, that on the one hand, he's saying the boys bear virtually no responsibility because they're just a product of the events that have led up to that point. They're just a domino chain, and they don't really have any real volition. They are shaped by their environment. But he's saying to the judge, tell me that you can visit the wrath of fate and chance upon a 19-year-old boy. So he's seeking to persuade the judge that although the boys aren't guilty, the judge is very much responsible for this court case. They were easily detected because they kind of bungled the crime, and a pair of horn-rimmed tortoise-shell glasses with a hinge was traced to a Chicago optometrist who'd only sold 3 such prescriptions, and they were quickly rounded up. He was successful in that trial, and there have been other trials. There's one called the Twinkie case, where someone committed a crime under the influence of Twinkies, which are sugar-rich sweets, and they argued in their defense that they should be have diminished responsibility. We use this language of diminished responsibility in courts, or whether someone's fit to stand trial, whether they're criminally insane. And that's very interesting because the whole language of culpability and responsibility is something that shows you immediately that this isn't an academic debate. It has a lot of bearing upon legal questions of culpability and responsibility. So there are 3 broad positions here, and I'm just going to outline them now. One is hard determinism. That's the view that we've just had here put forward. And essentially, hard determinism is made up of 2 things. I'll just outline these. They are universal causality and causal determinism, or causal necessity. Right? So universal causality is the idea that every event results from prior causes. Okay? You don't choose your desires, your choices, your actions, your feelings, because the brain states that make you up result from prior causes. Now, if you take this to its logical conclusion, you're almost saying the reason you're stood watching this video in front of a computer screen is because the Big Bang happened 13.7 billion years ago. So it can be reduced to absurdity, this idea, but it's kind of saying you didn't invent yourself. These boys who committed that murder, they weren't responsible for their upbringing, for the environmental influences that led to the kind of neglect that brought them to the point where they would conscience committing a murder. So universal causality is that every event results from prior causes. Event 3 results from causes 2 and 1. And then causal necessity, that once you have 1 and 2, 3 is inevitable. That's causal necessity, the claim that the chain of cause and effect is such that effects must necessarily follow on from prior causes. Once you start one domino falling, the others will result. Now, the problem with causal necessity is, to be sure of this, you'd need universal, omniscient knowledge of all prior causes to predict the future. One of the key features of science is its predictive force. And hard determinism doesn't have predictive force. It can't tell you who should be in jail next year because of all the causal inputs that have gone into their life hitherto. So it's not a science. It often pretends to be. And of course, there's lots of evidence from science that might point in the direction of hard determinism, such as genetics and epigenetics, or behavioral sciences, psychology, possibly a lot more now known about neurology, studies of twins and so on. All of that might point in the direction of hard determinism, that people's behaviors are not under their control or their choices, in the sense that they could have done differently than they did. So remember those two things: universal causality, right? Every event that is in effect is preceded by a cause, and causal necessity. Once you have stacked up multiple events, it's like a domino chain, the next one is inevitable. So that leads us to these three positions. Hard determinism is the view that hereditary factors, environmental causes, physical causes, psychological causes, neurological causes shape people's behavior and determine future events. And if we knew exhaustively about all of the prior causes, then we would certainly be able to predict the future. There are lots of thinkers who take this view. Ted Hondrick is perhaps the most famous hard determinist in Britain today. If you go to his website, you can see lots of materials about his view. He thinks it's quite a sad position in some senses. You've got to come to terms with the fact that your life choices are somewhat restricted, and you can have attitudinal freedoms, like it's raining outdoors. There's nothing I can do about that, but I can have a positive attitude. But you can't have life hopes in the sense that you have total freedom when born in absolute poverty to rise to the White House or whatever. He doesn't really believe that you can significantly change the factors that have shaped your life hitherto. Now, the opposite view of that is the libertarian view. And it says that we're far more free than we want to take responsibility for. And often we kind of plump for hard determinism because we want to shrug our shoulders and say, well, we couldn't have done otherwise than we did. Life is pretty boxed in and determined. But the libertarian, like Jean-Paul Sartre, would say, no, that's acting in bad faith, malfoy, that you are pretending to be an object rather than a subject that can act actively in your life. You're pretending to be passive and just driven by external forces acting upon you. And this is because you don't want to take responsibility for your life. There are lots of thinkers who've taken this view. Another would be Immanuel Kant. Kant very much believes that you have, if you remember Kant, you've got this noumenal world and you've got the phenomenal world, and the phenomenal world is entirely physical and it's determined. So where does free will come from? Well, there must be a noumenal world where free will exists, and to the extent that our minds can and reason can extend into the noumenal realm, we can be said to, unlike animals, be free to have choices. Kant, of course, thought that freedom was one of the postulates of practical rationality. In other words, you had to assume it in order for morality to have any sense. You know, you can't say ought. Well, as Kant says, ought implies can, unless there is freedom to do otherwise than you do. You can't blame or praise people, and you can't be said to take responsibility for your actions. So Kant believes that you can kind of jump into this world or exit, in a sense, the purely physical realm, and so far as your reason and your duty is driving you and the moral law, rather than hypothetical imperatives down here in the physical world where you're just like a beast and you follow your emotions and your desires, then you can be said to be free as long as you're following your reason and your duty. So he's another thinker like that. Then there are thinkers like Henry Bergson. Henry Bergson says that this is, in some sense, a question of perspective. We can't really think ourselves out of free will and freedom because he gives the example of time. You know, if I say, you know, here's a watch, the watch is telling the time. But if I'm a very elderly man who's maybe in his 80s, I'm conscious that I haven't got a lot of time left. So the clock isn't conscious of time. It doesn't kind of feel, you know, my goodness, time's flying now. When I was 10, I thought the world would last forever. But now that I'm 80 plus, I realize time flies and I've got limited amounts of it. So the perspective that Bergson says is that we can look at the world objectively as if, you know, it were a kind of set of physical processes, but human beings don't orientate themselves in that way. This is a discipline called phenomenology that Henry Bergson and Heidegger kind of draw on. Phenomenology kind of says, one way of looking at the world is to take the subjective stance, to say, what does it feel like to be you? And from that perspective, all the time you have a sense of torn choices, a sense of life being full of forks in the road. And you can be there in the restaurant and you can't just say, well, I'll just see what happens. The waitress or waiter is going to ask you what you want, and you have to make a choice. Well, not in these days of social isolation, but when we go back. Now, the odd thing is these two positions hold something in common, right? And that's to say they are both incompatibilists, right? Incompatibilists argue that voluntariness, making freely willed decisions, and alternative possibilities are necessary. When they define freedom, they mean liberty of indifference, not liberty of spontaneity. What's the difference? Well, liberty of indifference is you're indifferent. You could go that way or you could go that way, right? Either way, you know, it's open, right? You might go that way, you might go this way. Today you might choose marmalade, tomorrow you might choose chocolate spread. And the next day you might choose chocolate spread rather than marmalade. You could go either way, liberty of indifference. Whereas liberty of spontaneity is there's only one choice, but you feel like making that choice. And the famous example is the one that John Locke gives. I think I mentioned it here. He talks about waking up in a locked room where you see a friend that you haven't come across for many years, and you decide to stay with that friend all day. Why would you want to leave the room? So John Locke is a compatibilist of sorts, and he says that if you did come across a friend and you were in a locked room, but you weren't aware that the door was locked, then you might as well say that you were free. That you, so here's the example, sorry, it's taken a bit while to find it. Locke's position is well illustrated in the example of a man who's carried whilst fast asleep into a room where is a person he longs to see and speak with, and there, locked fast in, beyond his power to get out, he awakes and is glad to find himself in so desirable a company, which he stays willingly in. Now, there aren't any alternative possibilities. He couldn't have left if he'd wanted to. But for Locke's money, he is free, as long as he chooses to be free. It doesn't matter whether there are or aren't alternative possibilities, he is said to be free. So all choices are caused. The soft determinist is just believing in liberty of spontaneity. As long as you feel that your choice is free, then it is free. But we obviously know examples of people like drug addicts or kleptomaniacs who can't help themselves stealing in shops. And their compulsive behavior troubles us precisely because they aren't free as compared to other people. And the soft determinist doesn't seem to be able to make this distinction between people who have compulsive behavior and people who have liberty of spontaneity, or liberty of indifference, could take either view, as opposed to liberty of spontaneity. They feel that they've made a choice, but they couldn't have done otherwise than they did if they'd wanted to. So the debate, some people think, is really between compatibilists who think, well, you can fudge it, and freedom really is just the feeling of being free, liberty of spontaneity, and incompatibilists, people who think if you've got genuine freedom, then that means a fork in the road. Hard determinists say you haven't got it, but they agree with libertarians that if you were to prove that you had free will, it would have to mean that you genuinely had alternative possibilities. So we've mentioned Ted Honderich. Ted is concerned about the implications for our lives, and he's very much into neuroscience. He says, it follows about states of brain as effects that on every occasion when we decide or choose, we can only decide or choose as we do. So he thinks that we should be dismayed at the austerity of this view. Our life hopes, our sense that we're real agents and can voluntarily originate choices within ourselves and our minds, that must take a battering. In other words, if it's true that universal causality and causal necessity are true, if events are like a domino chain, you can't originate an event in yourself. So imagine you're kind of here. So imagine we say this is you, and you're at this point here where you're an addict and you're an alcoholic and you would go on to have liver disease, and you can't just kind of originate to decide to join Alcoholics Anonymous and to become teetotal unless prior circumstances that went into your life would have driven you that way. Maybe the parental influence or the love of some people in your life pulls you back from the brink of liver disease and pushes you in a different direction. But in that case, this was never going to be a possibility. So there's just a single track to your life, and it's the causal inputs that have led to you moving in that direction. There is no alternative possibility. You were never going to go down the road of alcoholism all the way to liver disease. You were always going to, at some point, pull back from the brink, and because people loved you or made you believe in yourself, you're always going to kind of go in this direction. So Ted Honderich thinks that for good or for ill, our life choices are out. States of the brain are in the first place effects, and the effects of other physical states, all actions and movements caused by states of the brain. Now, you might think, look, I understand if a car is out of control and its brakes have gone and it's just driven by sheer momentum, there might be nothing that a driver can do to stop it. But we're not like cars. We have free will. Well, Honderich says the more we know about neurology and genetics and brain states, the more we know that the causal determinants shape those brain states. And there are some extraordinary stories about people having growths in their brain that lead them to do criminal acts. And when those growths are removed, the desire to do criminal acts has gone. And when the growth comes back, the criminal desires arise in them again. So you could say that would point in the direction of hard determinism. So in his book, A Theory of Determinism, How Free Are You? He looks at various problems with determinism. He says, don't believe quantum theory will get you out of this if you are putting your hopes on free will, on quantum theory, because quantum theory, which has elements of randomness to it, only works at the subatomic level, and the brain operates at the level of the molecular or the atomic level. So that's irrelevant, he thinks. And he says the incompatibilist objection that we can both be determined and held responsible for our behavior also has to go out. But he thinks that, interestingly, if you took a hard determinist line, you might well be a lot more gracious towards criminals, rather like Sweden and Denmark are. You would kind of view them as machines that had malfunctioned and needed to be retrained and reprogrammed, rather than, terribly wicked and wrong and needing to have retributive punishment upon them. So he says this, imagine you are one of only 2 people left on planet Earth. You're terminally ill, and you're the judge who's imprisoned the other survivor who murdered a third, now deceased survivor. You have it in your power to execute this prisoner. What would you do? Now, if you were into retributional justice, you would execute, if it was a state that had capital punishment, you'd execute that prisoner. But what would be the point? The last person on earth would have been executed for no good reason. And Honderich thinks that we do very much the same in our world today. We carry out this irrational retributive justice, and instead what we should do is to emphasize rehabilitation or reconditioning of people, work on their brains, maybe use, chemical castration on rapists, or have anger therapy for people who are given to violence, to reprogram in that way and then rehabilitate them into society. Now, if we needed further evidence for evolution or for hard determinism, it can come from evolutionary psychology. In 1859, Darwin, of course, published The Origin of the Species, but what that came to show was that our mammalian brain has been massively shaped by its history. And the reason why we are prone to take the fast route to thinking rather than the slow route, that means to say we act rather than rationally and deliberately, we very often act on the basis of fight and flight and emotions, is because for millions of years our brain developed in the state of monkeys and apes, and it's still largely shaped by emotions in the way it behaves. So, we sometimes talk about being 90% chimp and 10% bee. We can be cooperative, we can be rational and deliberative, but generally speaking, we're driven very much by our psychology. If you wanted an example of this, why are we so fascinated by fatty foods, carbohydrates, and sugar-rich foods? Because they were very scarce in our ancient, in the African savannas where we originated. They were very scarce, and so we would hoard them or eat them whenever possible. And now that they're freely available as refined sugar, we haven't lost that. So genetics is a big part of this. We do studies on twins, and we can see a great deal of the predictive force of genetics on behavior, and behavioralism. Now, you'd have heard of Ivan Pavlov and his dog, which he could train with a bell. He gave it food, and every time he gave it food, a bell rang, and in the end, it would salivate even when the bell rang without food, because it was an unconditioned reflex. So psychology tends towards this sense of hard determinism. And there are lots of experiments that sort of back this up. There's the Libet test, there's the Stanford prison experiment, and there's B.F. Skinner's behavioral training of, or operant conditioning of pigeons and other mammals, that all indicate how conditioned human behavior can be, and that seems to all point in the direction of hard determinism. Now, is there any way in which we could come back against this and say, no, let's give free will a chance? Well, here are some criticisms of hard determinism. First of all, Susan Blakemore says it makes no sense to distinguish sharply between acts that result from conscious attention and those that result from our reflexes or damage to the brain. But if it's hard to view human nature, if this is how hard determinists view human nature, we can wonder whether determinism lacks the language to do justice to the evidence we have of deliberately wrestling with dilemmas. So you have to take into account the evidence that comes from your own experience of having the feeling of choice, having a sense that you have agency and some control on the handles of your life. You can steer in a certain way or another. So you have to kind of deny all of that personal evidence that you might express yourself. We've already mentioned Immanuel Kant. Freedom is a condition of the moral law. Ought implies can. If we didn't have free will, we couldn't hold people responsible. There's the idea of causal necessity, which is problematic. And yeah, we can read through these points here. We would have no exhaustive knowledge or be omniscient to know this. So the most that hard determinists can argue is that if exhaustive knowledge of universal causation were available prior to the moment, then hypothetically we could predict the future. If you've ever seen Minority Report, one of the problems in it is that Tom Cruise, who becomes accused of a murder before he does it, doesn't in reality do it. So the predictive force of hard determinism is problematic. Another interesting critic is Noam Chomsky. He's a kind of public intellectual, and he says, if you tell everybody that hard determinism is true, it makes them kind of passive. And that's exactly what a lot of multinationals and governments would like. They would like to be able to engineer people without much resistance. And if people take the view, hey, there's nothing we can do about it, and they just down tools, then it kind of undermines activism, and it stops people taking a sense of self-determination into their own hands politically. Is it falsifiable? Karl Popper said that the test of true science is the willingness of claims to be falsified. Otherwise, it's pseudoscience. Hard determinism doesn't really offer us any way of falsifying it, and that seems to be what makes it into pseudoscience. There are some other criticisms that we could mention there. I think one other interesting one is, can we make sense of moral backsliding if morally wrong actions are involuntary and not self-originated? How can we meaningfully distinguish them from blinking? So if you say, I don't know, once I was lazy, but over time I've learned to work really hard, well, we would typically say, well, that's a really good progression, you know, you have matured. Or once I didn't treat women with respect, but now I value them as equal, and I treat them with respect and dignity, then we would generally say that's an applaudable progression. You have matured as a human being. But this language of hard determinism just says, well, once you had one brain state of chemistry and now you have another, it's not able to give praise or blame to people. Of course, David Hume would say, well, that's not a problem because human nature is bound to have feelings of praise and blame, whether they're rational or not. So they'll be reliable regardless of whether they have any basis in thought. We've mentioned John Locke, and you can read about his ideas in more detail. Another example of compatibilism is David Hume, as we've mentioned. You could read all about his theory of liberty, of spontaneity. In a treatise concerning human understanding, he has a whole chapter on, as he calls it, liberty or necessity, an inquiry concerning human understanding, the later edition of that. And he thinks that this whole debate has just really been a question of language. And once we understand the language clearly, we can define liberty quite easily. He talks about liberty of spontaneity, and he says what we can't have is liberty of indifference, in which we have genuine alternative possibilities. And he defines liberty: by liberty or freedom, we can only mean a power of acting or not acting according to the determinations of the will. If we choose to remain at rest, we may. If we choose to move, we may. So you have freedom to feel certain things, and the power of acting and not acting according to the will, but you don't really get to determine all of the preceding events that have led to your will being shaped as it is. They are kind of set beforehand. Now, some spanners to throw into the works here. Philosopher Harry Frankfurt's an interesting guy. Here's a picture of Harry, and he's a brilliant philosopher, and he gives this example from a political election stance in America, where they have the Democrats versus the Republicans. There's a Democrat voting neuroscientist who's implanted a microchip switch inside thousands of voters' brains, and on election day it picks up prior signals of someone voting Republican, and then it switches on and activates their mind to vote Democrat. And in such a scenario, it's quite possible to imagine people who don't show any prior signals of voting Republican, they're going to vote Democrat, and the machine doesn't switch on. Now, Frankfurt says, are they free? They've made a choice, but there wasn't any alternative possibility, because the microchip would have activated had there been any prior signal that they were going to vote Republican. So what Frankfurt's challenging is this idea that you need an alternative possibility to be said to be free. They can be held morally responsible for that action without there needing to have been alternative possibilities. So Frankfurt cases are cases where you don't necessarily have to have alternative possibilities, and you can still be said to be free. I don't know if you're persuaded by that. Is it possible to be free without alternative possibilities? I think another important point here is from Henry Bergson and the phenomenologists. This is Heidegger and Bergson. And Bergson, he says that determinism has a pacifying effect on people. And he argues that human beings measure time not like clocks, but by our feelings as well. We can feel time moving slowly as we wait for the bus, or moving very quick as we do an exam. And human behavior is far less predictable than that of objects, which are predictable. So he wants to say, take into account the evidence of your own experience, your own phenomenal experience of life and your senses and your perception, and you will have a strong sense of free will. That's evidence. Count that evidence. Don't discount it. Of course, dualists believe that we aren't just physical, we're also soul. Or with Descartes, we have a mind-body dualism. Plato is a dualist, Descartes was a dualist, Alvin Plantinga is a dualist, and they think very much of, at this higher level of the mind, we can have top-down causation. So if I just draw an example of this, this is the view. If you have a kind of brain here, so this is your brain inside your head, and the question is our brain states, do brain states just kind of create this fiction of mind and the self, right? Is that just a fiction that they create? That's one view, and that view is known as epiphenomenalism, right? So the epi just means upon, you know, a kind of above. So this is the epi here, and what's the phenomenon it creates? It's the mind. Okay, so there is no self. That's just a pure fiction. That's one view. Okay, and that would be a kind of physicalist view, and a physicalist and determinist view there. But I could take another view, and this would be that there is such a thing as mind. It might be greater than the sum of its parts. It might be, and the example that Saul Kripke uses is of H2O, how water is hydrogen and oxygen, but you can have hydrogen and oxygen and it not make water. So you can have the same materials, you know, you can have the brain, but it can be more than the sum of its parts. It can eventually develop top-down causation. So if it can develop top-down causation and the mind can influence the brain as well as the brain influence the mind, you know, if you know, people who are drunk, for instance, their brain is affected by chemicals that inhibit neurotransmitters, or if you take ibuprofen, that would inhibit pain transmitters. So you've altered your brain state, and that's altered how you feel. You no longer feel in pain, or a drunk person no longer kind of maybe remembers things or whatever. So that would alter their mind. But in this instance, your mind can also, as well as the bottom up, it can have top-down causation on your behavior. So you could reason something, and that reason could influence your behavior. It could shape your behavior. I could say, like the example I gave before, the alcoholic decides, I'm going to take a different course in life, I'm going to change my behavior, and lo and behold, he's now teetotal and behaves totally differently. Or someone could reason, you know, I need to work harder, and then that influences their behavior. Someone could reason, I'm in this particular course of life at the moment, but I'd like to be here in 5-10 years' time. Therefore, I'm going to do these sort of things, and that influences their behavior. So the mind can influence the brain, and that would be evidence for free will. Whereas the epiphenomenalist thinks that this is all a fiction. The idea of the brain and the mind is purely fictional, and it's a byproduct of brain states. So if you're, you know, a hard determinist and you're very much drawing on neurology, genetics, neuroscience, genetics, and evolutionary psychology, you're going to take a very physicalist view of reality, and you're going to kind of see people as quite determined. Yeah, we're coming on to look at a set text at Albert Camus or Jean-Paul Sartre, and they very much believe in radical freedom, that because existence precedes essence. In other words, Plato is an essentialist. He believed that you were born with a fixed kind of nature, an eternal soul that had been existent before you were born and had memory of what preceded it. But existentialists think, no, you're just born as a kind of blank slate, and any essence, any meaning or purpose in your life is something that you create. So existence, you're born with a blank slate before everything. The essence is something that you must create, and that's it. It leads to kind of anxiety, because we have to take responsibility for our life. I mean, Camus said the only interesting philosophical question is suicide, because in occupied France, once you've decided to live rather than say, I won't follow orders and face the consequences of Vichy France or the Nazis, you must take responsibility for your actions. You must choose yourself. And it's easy to act in bad faith. This is where we choose to live as passive objects and just let other forces and circumstances act upon us, because sometimes that is easier, just to step in line with an authority figure who looks like they know what they're doing and gives us some security. But Sartre says, no, it's not good enough. And he gives the example of, living in occupied France. He did try to help some people to escape. It's an interesting question that a student comes to him once and says, should he look after his elderly mother, or should he join the Free French Army? And Sartre says, well, go and make your own decision. You can't devolve responsibility onto me. So he's very well aware that people want to avoid responsibility, and hard determinism is a nice get-out clause, but maybe we are far freer than we actually think we are. He says, the idea I've never ceased to try to develop is that in the end, a man can always make something out of what was made of him. A man can always make something out of what was made of him. So we are far freer than we might think. There's also the argument from interpersonal emotions. This is that we aren't, again, just objective physical beings. We're also emotive and emotional. We have reactive attitudes, and these include, attitudes of forgiveness, hurt, resentment. Much of our brain, the cerebral cortex, has been developed to interact with other humans. Perhaps the most complex thing that our brain is required to compute every day. How do we interact with other people? Interpersonal emotions and attitudes of praise and blame, says Strawson, are hardwired into us. We can never outrun our nature, and therefore we needn't worry about hard determinism, because we will always emote, we'll always praise, we'll always blame. And it follows from this also that we do actually make distinctions between psychopaths and people who are not fit to stand trial, and mainstream members of society for whom emotions function perfectly well. It would be useless for us to ask whether or not it would be rational to do what is not in our nature to be able to do. In other words, we are always going to be people who praise and blame, even if criminals can't, because of their past history, do otherwise than they did. Strawson maintains that our ordinary ways of talking about responsibility and human character are best left unreplaced and unreduced. They require no justification beyond the fact that they work very well in ordinary life. So whatever you think of this debate, human emotions will reliably carry on praising and blaming people. There's an interesting debate there, because there's another philosopher, Saul Spalinsky, who thinks that it's not good for philosophers to go around telling people that everything's determined, because that tends to add to their feeling of powerlessness in life, and it sort of disenables them. We haven't really got time to go into a theological debate here, but I'll just kind of mention this very briefly. all of these categories of compatibilism, hard determinism, libertarianism, all have their precursors in the theological debates that go back to the 4th century and 5th century with Augustine and a monk called Pelagius. Now, what was going on there is quite interesting. In Rome, which was supposedly a Christian city, Pelagius, who was a British monk, turned up, and he was appalled by the moral standards of so-called Christians in Rome. And he blamed this all on Augustine's teaching about how God had predestined some people to be the elect and go to heaven, and predestined some people to be the damned and so on. And he thought this was very deterministic, and it made people very kind of, what the heck, you know, either I'm one of the elect, in which case I'm fine, or I'm one of the damned, in which case there's nothing I can do about it. So it didn't put much agency and responsibility on people. And Pelagius thought that this led to moral complacency, and that although Adam had fallen, human nature still had free will. And he rejected Augustine's idea that, no, it didn't. We were born with original sin, a bias to do evil and to rebel against God. And so Pelagius emphasizes greater degrees of responsibility because he's worried about this moral corruption in Rome. And Augustine won the day, really, in their debate. Augustine was a more powerful kind of bishop of Hippo, and he very much put down Pelagianism as a heresy, and it was thrown out of the church at a synod or a council, a church council. So that's the first round of this debate. And then a second round of this debate crops up in the 16th century between John Calvin and Jacobus Arminius. Now, Jacobus Arminius argues that because God foreknows our human choices, he is a just judge. He isn't predestining people to hell, as Calvin taught, merely because of his divine will. He's doing it because he knew beforehand how they were going to behave, and therefore he's entirely just. He's just got the results ahead of time. Arminius believes also that Christ died for everybody, not just for the elect. And so they came to head over this, and this debate still goes on in Christianity today. John Wesley said, if a man were not free, he could not be accountable for his thoughts, words, and actions. If he were not free, he would not be capable of reward or punishment. He would not be capable of being morally good or bad. But for Calvin, God is completely in control. He's omnipotent and omniscient, and it is certain that not one drop of rain falls without God's sure command. God, if you have freedom and you could kind of second guess God and take history off at a different direction, a bit like, what's his name in the film? I'm trying to think of the name of the film, famous TV show where there's a character who's trying to break out of the reality TV show he's been born into, and he can't escape that. But he does. In the end, he manages to spot that it's all a fake and his life isn't real, and he walks away from the TV show. If you could do that, then of course God wouldn't be sovereign. He would be undercut by your freedom. So Calvin thinks that the eternal decree of God, by which he determined with himself whatever he wished to happen with regard to every man, not all are created on equal terms. Some are preordained to eternal life, others to eternal damnation. And as each has been created for one or the other of these ends, we may say he's been predestined to life or death. Now, Calvin didn't believe that this was because God foreknew. He did foreknow everything, but he predestined, he predetermined who the elect and the damned were. God's foreknowledge cannot be the reason for our election, because when God surveys the whole of humankind, he will find them all under the same curse. So none of them are righteous, and therefore if God elects some to grace, it's purely through his own free choice. Now there's one way to get out of this, and I am going on here at length, so apologies for this. And that's Henry de Molina, or Louis de Molina. He was in the 16th century as well. And Molinism, which William Lane Craig, a modern philosopher, kind of picks up, is essentially arguing that there are three kinds of knowledge. So there's natural knowledge. This is God kind of has every single possibility that there could be in the world. So if you think of natural knowledge as, you know, here's world A, B, C, D, E, F, G, and it goes on to infinity. There's endless possibilities that God could have made, endless ways in which he could have placed you and I in different centuries, in different families or whatever. Then there's let's go to free knowledge, God's knowledge of the actual world. So this is the actual world that we live in. Now, how do you get from these myriad possibilities to this one possibility, the actual world? Well, here, God is able to line up people's free will with his sovereignty. He's able to stay in control of guiding history towards the conclusion he wants, but also taking into account, because of his foreknowledge, people's free will. So that's the way Louis de Molina solves this. Middle knowledge is God's foreknowledge of all future free actions and how his creatures would act if he were to place them in any possible set of circumstances. So in doing that, the example he gives, if Jesus' disciple Judas was placed as his disciple, God knew beforehand that he would betray him, therefore fulfilling his overall plan of crucifixion and resurrection. So Judas is still responsible because he's making his free choice, but God hasn't lost any of his sovereignty, because between every possible world he could create and the actual world, he's lining up people's free choices with his predestined choice. So there are lots and lots of questions to concern ourselves with here. And I've just summarized at the end what the options are. Hard determinism, what are the benefits, what are the costs? Compatibilism, what are the benefits, what are the costs? And free will, what are the benefits, what are the costs? And there are loads of questions that can stem from this. And we can ask ourselves a lot about this question. I'm going to, for the moment, leave it there. There's an interesting statement at the end about Robert Kane's view. David Hume wants to get rid of the idea of free will by saying really there are only two choices. Either actions arise outside of us and are determined by a chain of cause and effect that comes before us and shapes our character, personality, genes, and decisions, or they're completely random as they arise within us and irrational. But they can't be rational and free. Either they're predetermined, as in they come from before us, or they are irrational and random. And Kane has this example where he talks about it's almost like he says it's like a chamber with a kind of bubble, and the bubble, if you imagine like a spirit level, the bubble can go up and it can go down, and this is kind of like, imagine you've got choice A, the bubble going up, and choice B, the bubble going down. And you have this every time you have a kind of torn feeling of, will I do this? Will I do that? I just don't know which way to go. And there are good reasons for going with A, and there are good reasons for going with B. Now, this is random. It could go either way right up to the last minute. But what's interesting, it doesn't originate from outside us. This torn choice is happening within us, and it's indeterminate until the very last moment. And it's not entirely random, because there are reasons any which way it goes. Maybe you say, I want to go to York University, or I want to go to Newcastle University, and there are good reasons on both sides. Or maybe you say, I want to study engineering, or you say, I want to study medicine, and I'm not sure. There are good reasons on both sides. And at the very last minute, you kind of flip a coin and it goes one way or the other. Now, that's independent origination. In other words, it happens inside of you, not outside of you. And sorry, the focus has just gone here. And it's also something that you have freely willed and chosen. And it's not entirely random because you're reasoning it. Now, that's a fairly exhaustive discussion of hard determinism and soft determinism. I'd like us to meet and to chat and discuss this, maybe looking at some past paper questions, and we can debate whether we do this next lesson or the lesson after.